This is the lecture for John Rawls' A Theory of Justice, sections 1 through 4. So the first topic is that you'll notice when you open up the reading, we're here in chapter 1, and then there's a paragraph, and then there's section 1, which is the beginning of the reading. So also read this paragraph. So don't, even though it's not listed in the reading assignment, read the paragraph. It will help summarize the stuff that we're going to read in the rest of the reading assignment, and it makes things clearer. So read this paragraph. So that's the first point. Second, we're going to talk about just a relatively small point, but it's probably the first thing people sort of misunderstand or miss when they're reading this book, and so it helps to point it out both on its own and just to illustrate a larger point. So when you begin reading the assignment, first you'll read the first paragraph, and then you'll get into section 1. And Rawls says, justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is of systems of thought. A theory, however elegant and economical, must be rejected or revised if it is untrue. Likewise, laws and institutions, no matter how efficient and well arranged, must be reformed or abolished if they are unjust. Each person possesses an inviolability founded on justice that even the welfare of society as a whole cannot override, and so on and so forth. And so this first paragraph is all about stuff about justice. And then he says, these propositions seem to express our intuitive conviction of the primacy of justice. No doubt they are expressed too strongly. And for one reason or another, it's relatively common for people to sort of not take this seriously, this one sentence that he writes. So, it's a short sentence. There's a lot of stuff to read, and so it doesn't get in your head or you skim over it or something. But I mean, look at what he's saying. He says, these propositions no doubt are expressed too strongly. That means all this stuff that he said in this first paragraph, he's not saying it's necessarily true. He's saying this is too strong. I, Rawls, do not believe all of this. This all seems to express our intuitive conviction of the primacy of justice, but it's too strong. This is not what I, Rawls, endorse. And he doesn't think this is what you endorse either. So he says, no doubt they're expressed too strongly. So he thinks, look, even you are going to think this is too strong. So that's just to point out a small thing, which is, do not mistake Rawls as saying, like, I believe all of this, because you're going to very badly misunderstand a lot of what comes later if you think that he thinks all of this is 100% true. He doesn't think all of this is 100% true. We don't know what he thinks about it. We know he thinks these are too strong, but like how strong? Like, do we get rid of all of this, or like, is it just like a little too strong? So it's not like we know what he thinks yet, but just to be clear, he does not think all of this. And so do not mistakenly read him as trying to prove all of this in this book. And so that's a small point, and I just pointed out because, it's on the second page of the reading, and people often miss it, so that's just to highlight that. And I also pointed out just to highlight a general point about everything in this class and everything in every philosophy class, which is please read very, very carefully. Read as carefully as you can. Every word and sentence is in there for a reason. The philosophers are not writing anything just for fun or just to make their word count longer. They're writing everything because they want to explain things to you, and so they only put in things that help explain the point. And so when somebody says, all this stuff, and then he says these propositions no doubt are expressed too strongly, he means it, like that this is all too strong, like this is all not exactly what he thinks. And so you want to be reading carefully and not sort of skipping or skimming any parts, because you could miss something very important. So that's just a lesson to internalize for the entire semester and really your entire life in terms of engaging with philosophy. The next thing to point out is a few pages later on page 5, he says, he's talked about this idea of a well-ordered society on page 4, and he says, existing societies are, of course, seldom well-ordered in the sense, for what is just and unjust is usually in dispute. So in existing societies, what is just and unjust is usually in dispute. Men disagree about which principles should define the basic terms of their association. Yet we may still say, despite this disagreement, that they each have a conception of justice. That is, they understand the need for, and they are prepared to affirm, a characteristic set of principles for assigning basic rights and duties, and for determining what they take to be the proper distribution of the benefits and burdens of social cooperation. So this is what it is to have a conception of justice. You understand the need for, and you're prepared to affirm, a characteristic set of principles for assigning blah, 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 blah. So he says, thus, it seems natural to think of the concept of justice as distinct from the various conceptions of justice, and as being specified by the role that these different sets of principles, these different conceptions, have in common. So people have disagreements over what is just and unjust. And the way Rawls puts it is that they have different conceptions of justice. They have different understandings of how things should work. But, so they all have different conceptions of justice. And what those conceptions sort of share in common is the concept of justice. So they're all conceptions of justice. So they're all conceptions of the same sort of thing, the same concept. So this is the sort of concept-conception distinction that Rawls is talking about here. He says there's a concept of justice, which is this sort of big overarching thing that everybody agrees on. And then we have a bunch of disagreeing conceptions of justice, like people have different understandings of the concept. And I bring this up just because this is like an interesting idea. He's using it to talk about justice here. There's the concept of justice and then different conceptions of justice. But you could apply it to lots and lots of other things too. Like really most concepts, maybe not most, but many concepts you can sort of think, oh, there's the concept of whatever, and then people have different conceptions of whatever. So just an interesting thing to maybe take from the reading. Moving on to a little bit later in the reading, I want to point out something which is pretty important from the sort of, like for Rawls, like for understanding what's going on in Rawls, but when you read it in the reading, you might not realize sort of how important it is, because, you know, there's lots of different stuff going on. So I just want to highlight what's going on here, and so you can be prepared to take this seriously. This is something he talks a lot about later in the book, but we're not reading those parts. We'll see briefly in the third reading, this comes back like in a very small sentence, but this is the only exposure we're going to get to this idea in the reading, so take it seriously. So on pages 17 to 18, he's talking about there's another side to justifying a particular description of the original position. And of course, you don't know what this means yet, but he's talking about how can he sort of justify, or how can he prove, or how can he explain this theory that he's going to put forth in his book, which involves this idea of the original position. And he says, another way to sort of justify my theory is to see if the principles which would be chosen match our considered convictions of justice or extend them in an acceptable way. We can note whether applying these principles would lead us to make the same judgments about the basic structure of society which we now make intuitively, and in which we have the greatest confidence, or whether in cases where our present judgments are in doubt and given with hesitation, these principles offer a resolution which we can affirm on reflection. There are questions which we feel sure must be answered in a certain way. For example, we are confident that religious intolerance and racial discrimination are unjust. We think we have examined these things with care and have reached what we believe is an impartial judgment, not likely to be distorted by an excessive attention to our own interests. These convictions, so the conviction that religious intolerance and racial discrimination are unjust, these convictions are provisional fixed points, which we presume any conception of justice must fit. But we have much less assurance as to what the correct distribution of wealth and authority, Here we may be looking for a way to remove our doubts. We can check an interpretation of, well, blah, blah, blah. In searching for the most favored description of the situation, we work from both ends. We begin by describing it so that it represents generally shared and, well, actually, let's not read this paragraph for a while. So he says, look, we're trying to figure out how to understand this theory of justice I'm making. And one way to do this is we can sort of see whether my theory of justice fits the judgments which we have the greatest confidence in. So when I give my theory of justice, does it tell us that religious intolerance and racial discrimination is unjust? And we can also see for questions that we're not sure about, like, how should we divide up wealth and authority? We can see whether the results that my theory gives, whether those seem like they're correct or whether on reflection we say, no, this doesn't sound right. Something must have gone wrong. So he says, like, we start with our considered judgments about things, which we're pretty sure about, and then we match those up against what our theory of justice says. And also, we start with things that we're not very sure about, and we match those up with what our theory of justice says, and we decide, does this sound right or not? And then in this next paragraph, he gives a sort of more detailed description of what's going on. And he says, in searching for the most favored description of the situation, we work from both ends. We begin by describing it so that it represents generally shared and preferably weak conditions. So we're going to ignore that for the moment. This will make more sense once you're doing the reading, but we then see if those conditions are strong enough to yield a significant set of principles. If not, we look for further premises equally reasonable, but if so, and so this is sort of just describing how he comes up with his theory of justice. And again, this will make more sense when you read. But then he says, if so, and these principles match our considered convictions of justice, then so far well and good. So if you come up with a theory of justice that has these different principles, and they match our considered convictions, the stuff we were pretty sure about earlier, then so far well and good. But presumably there will be discrepancies. So you come up with a theory of justice, and then it tells you some stuff that you didn't already believe, that doesn't match your considered convictions. In this case, we have a choice. We can either modify the account of the initial situation. So the account of the initial situation is sort of what is giving us our theory of justice. We can modify the account of the initial situation, or we can revise our existing judgments. For even the judgments we take provisionally as fixed points are liable to revision. By going back and forth, sometimes altering the conditions of the contractual circumstances, so this is sometimes changing our theory of justice. At others, withdrawing our judgments and conforming them to principle, I assume that eventually we shall find a description of the initial situation, so we'll find a theory of justice, that both expresses reasonable conditions and yields principles which match our considered judgments, duly pruned and adjusted. This state of affairs I refer to as reflective equilibrium. It's an equilibrium because at last our principles and judgments coincide, and it's reflective since we know to what principles our judgments conform and the premises of their derivation. So this process, reflective equilibrium, you start with your considered judgments and you come up with your theory of justice and then you compare them. They're not going to match 100%. So you sometimes fiddle with the theory of justice. Sometimes you give up some of your considered judgments, and you keep doing this until you reach an equilibrium. They fit together. You're happy with your considered judgments, as he notes, duly pruned and adjusted. So you'll get rid of a few of them and change a few of them, but you'll keep most of them. And you've got your theory of justice, which has been adjusted so that it fits many of your considered judgments, but not all of them, because some of them you're getting rid of. And so then you reach this point called reflective equilibrium. And then he goes on to note, this equilibrium is not necessarily stable. It's liable to be upset by further examination of the conditions with blah, blah, blah. And so he says, it's not like reflective equilibrium. When you reach it, you're there forever. Like you've finished thinking about justice and you never have to think about it again. No, he says, this can change over time. And you can sort of fall out of equilibrium and you have to keep thinking about justice and change your theory or your considered judgments and stuff like that. So this whole process that I just described, reflective equilibrium, again, this is the only time we're going to read about it, except for very briefly in the third reading. And it's just, I just want to flag that it's important. I mean, everything in this reading is important, but this is sort of part of his methodology for coming up with a theory of justice. And so we want to sort of remember that this is how Rawls thinks it's going to work. As he points out, I shall not, of course, actually work through this process. He leaves the work up to you. He imagines you doing this. So this is what Rawls is picturing in the background as what is going on when we're coming up with the theory of justice. And so just keep that in the back of our minds as we read the rest of the book that we're going to read. So that's reflective equilibrium. And then finally, I don't think, well, let's see, does it come up? Oh, yeah, I mean, he does mention utilitarianism a few points, but his main discussion of it is in section 5, which is, of course, right after our reading finishes, because we read up through section 4. And so I just want to explain utilitarianism because uh, Rawls is writing this book to give us a theory of justice, and what he takes to be one of his main opponents is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is also a theory of justice. It's a theory about how society should be run. And utilitarianism is pretty straightforward. It has two components. So utilitarianism has a theory of what is good and bad, and a theory of what you should do about what's good and bad. So starting with the theory of good and bad, good is utility and bad is disutility. What is utility? There's sort of two main understandings of it. So sort of two flavors of utilitarianism, two different kinds of utilitarians. One flavor of utilitarianism says that what is good or what leads to utility is pleasure. And the other flavor, sorry, I'm trying to adjust that. The other flavor of utilitarianism says that what is good is preference satisfaction. So if I have a preference for making a lot of money and eating potatoes every day, then it's good if I make a lot of money, and it's good if I eat potatoes every day. And then similarly, what is bad will be pain for the first flavor of utilitarianism, pain being sort of pain in the absence of pleasure. And then preference dissatisfaction for the other flavor of utilitarianism. So if I have a preference to visit Myanmar and go surfing, it will be bad if I do not get to visit Myanmar and I do not get to go surfing. So that's what's good and bad according to utilitarianism, these two sorts of options. And then the second part of utilitarianism is what should we do about stuff? And what we want to do is maximize the good. So just do whatever will get us the most good. And so you just sort of, for every option that you have, you add up how much good is it going to give you and how much bad is it going to give you, how much utility is it going to give you, how much disutility is it going to give you, how much pleasure is it going, sorry, not you, how much how much good is it going to produce, how much bad is it going to produce, how much utility is it going to produce, how much disutility is it going to produce, how much pleasure will it produce, how much pain will it produce, how many preferences will it satisfy, how many preferences will it frustrate. And then you just subtract the bad from the good. So, you subtract all the pain from the pleasure, or all the dissatisfied preferences from the satisfied preferences. And then whatever gives you the highest number, that is what you should do. So you wake up in the morning and you have three options. You can hit yourself in the hand with a hammer. You can study for a test, or you can devote your life to people who are less fortunate than you. And the utilitarian says, which of these should you do? Well, let's add up all the good and all the bad that would happen from these things, and probably the ranking is going to be the worst will be hit yourself with a hammer. That will produce more pain than pleasure, or it will produce more preference frustration than preference satisfaction. Second best is probably study for the test, and then probably best is devote your life to people less fortunate than you. So utilitarianism is pretty straightforward. And one of the, Rawls takes it to be one of his main opponents in coming up with a theory of justice. And how that's going to work, you'll see as you read. But it's just good to know, to have in the background, like, what is the utilitarian point of view about these things? And the utilitarian point of view of these things is that, well, we should do whatever maximizes the good in every situation. So that's utilitarianism, and keep that in the back of your mind as you read through Rawls, and really as you go through the rest of the class, because utilitarianism is always an option in political philosophy. And so like everybody is either explicitly or implicitly arguing against it, or sometimes arguing for it. And so yeah, there's great.